We begin our lives in search mode. Long before we understand what we're searching for, we already feel its absence. It starts as a subtle ache, an itch under the surface of things, a sense that something is missing, something just out of reach. So we look to parents for love, to teachers for answers, to books, belief systems, degrees, wealth, status, romance. Each pursuit promising to complete us, yet somehow never quite delivering. And then one day the search takes a sacred turn. We don't just want success, we don't just want happiness, we want truth, we want peace, we want something real, something untouched by the chaos of the world. That's when many of us turn to spirituality. We light incense, we enter temples, we bow before statues, we whisper mantras, we read the words of sages, and we start to chase this elusive figure we've heard so much about, the Buddha. But here's the paradox. The moment we start seeking the Buddha, we've already misunderstood his teachings, because the Buddha was never meant to be worshipped like a god. He wasn't asking for our devotion. He was inviting us to awaken, not to follow him, but to look where he looked. There's a story from ancient times of a man who spent decades traveling across India, visiting every holy site where the Buddha once walked. He fasted, he meditated on mountaintops, he begged at sacred rivers, he memorized sutras in Sanskrit, and finally, exhausted and aging, he returned home, his eyes weary, his heart still searching. He sat beneath a tree in his own backyard, closed his eyes, and simply breathed. And in that stillness, something happened. No visions, no lights, no cosmic voices, just a silence so vast, so complete, that for the first time in his life, he stopped seeking, and in that moment, he understood. He had been carrying the Buddha with him all along. You see, the danger is not in honoring great teachers. It's in forgetting where they're pointing. When the Buddha raised a single flower in silence, he wasn't giving a sermon. He was demonstrating something wordless. Presence, awareness, direct experience, he never said. Worship me, he said. Be a lamp unto yourself. That's not metaphor. That's a call to awaken. But awakening doesn't begin with fireworks. It begins with something far more uncomfortable. Turning inward, and let's be honest, most of us don't want to look inward. We'd rather stay busy. We'd rather do than be. We'd rather fix the outer world than sit quietly and face the storms within. Why? Because it's hard to face ourselves. It's hard to watch the mind in its raw, restless dance. One moment clinging, the next moment pushing away, never satisfied, never still. So instead, we keep moving, keep chasing, keep projecting our salvation onto temples, teachers, techniques. We think if we just find the right guru, the right practice, the right mantra, then the door will finally open. But the truth is, there is no door. There's just this moment, this breath, this awareness. The Buddha isn't hiding in a cave or behind a cloud. He's not encrypted in ancient scrolls. He's not locked inside statues of gold or stone. He's here in the space between your thoughts, in the stillness behind your breath, in the silence that watches the mind come and go. But to meet him, you have to stop looking out there. You have to turn toward the quietest part of your being, the part that has never been born and can never die. And this is not some lofty idea. It's not reserved for monks in robes or mystics in mountains. This truth is available to you, here now, in your ordinary, imperfect, ever-changing life. Because the Buddha is not a person you become. He's the awareness that's already watching, the one that was here, before you even knew you were searching. So the question is, how do I find the Buddha? The real question is, what am I doing that keeps me from recognizing him? Is it my attachments, my fears, my constant striving? Can I sit still long enough to see what's underneath? Because if I dare to stop seeking, If I dare to be still, to be silent, to be honest, I might discover that I've never been separate from the truth I long for. And once that's seen, the whole game changes. It's not about getting anywhere. It's about coming home to the part of you that has always known, but was patiently waiting for you to listen, not with your ears, but with your heart. In the quiet of your heart, there is a presence that does not change. It does not need fixing. It does not need improving. It only needs to be seen. That presence is the Buddha within, and perhaps that's why every journey, no matter how far it travels, eventually circles back to the place it began, the one place we forget to look, inside. And when the distractions fade, when the outer noise quiets down, we're left with the one question that has always mattered. If the Buddha is not outside and not somewhere else, then where exactly do we meet him? Maybe the answer lies not in another statue, but in something much closer, much more intimate, just beneath the surface of our own awareness. A candle flickers before a statue. Incense rises in a slow, sacred spiral. Palms are pressed, heads are bowed. A mantra is whispered from the lips of someone who's come seeking peace. It's a beautiful moment, sincere, quiet, full of intention, but not always full of understanding, because somewhere along the way, devotion became confused with dependence. We all long to feel connected to something greater, and there's something comforting about sacred images. The serene face of a Buddha carved in stone, eyes half closed, a faint smile that seems to say, "All is well." So we bring offerings, we light candles, we kneel, and slowly, without even realizing it, we begin to look to the statue. Instead of through it, we ask it to fix our lives, to grant our wishes, to protect our families. We begin to treat it like a divine vending machine. Insert prayer, receive blessing. But the Buddha didn't teach us to bow to him. He taught us to see through illusion, even the illusion of him. There's a well-known Zen koan. If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. At first glance, it sounds outrageous, even blasphemous, but it's not talking about violence. It's talking about awakening. Because if you think the Buddha is outside you, if you think enlightenment belongs to someone else, if you think salvation is something you have to get from a figure, from a teacher, from a temple, then you're trapped in illusion, even if that illusion is wearing a robe and sitting in lotus position. True reverence is not in building taller statues. It's in tearing down the walls between ourselves and truth. Yes, statues can be symbolic. Yes, rituals can be sacred. Yes, bowing can express humility and respect. But if we stop at the symbol, we miss the source. It's like mistaking the map for the journey, or worshiping a menu instead of tasting the food. You see, the Buddha wasn't interested in being idolized. He was interested in liberation. That's why he never claimed to be divine. He called himself Tathagata, one who has thus gone beyond illusion, gone beyond identity, gone beyond duality. And he wanted you to go too, not to worship his image, but to realize your own nature. There's a quiet danger in external worship. It can make us passive, dependent, always waiting for blessings. Instead of transforming ourselves, we hand our suffering to a statue and hope it takes it away. But healing doesn't come from the outside in. It comes from the inside out. Imagine a man drowning in a river. He sees a sign that says, "Swim this way to safety." And instead of swimming, he clings to the sign and begins to pray. The sign was never the goal. It was a pointer, just like the Buddha, just like every teaching, every mantra, every chant. None of them are the destination. They're fingers pointing to the moon. And as the saying goes, don't confuse the finger for the moon. So what does this mean for our practice? It means we need to shift the direction of our devotion. Instead of placing it all on an external object, can we turn it inward? Can we sit in silence and bow to the breath? Can we light a candle? In the cave of our own heart, can we chant? Not just with lips, but with awareness. Because when reverence becomes inwardly rooted, it no longer distracts. It deepens. It no longer separates. It unifies. That doesn't mean we abandon tradition. It means we infuse it with life. We bring meaning back to ritual by understanding what it's pointing toward. We don't worship the statue. We awaken the stillness it represents. We don't cling to the image of the Buddha. We embody the clarity he revealed. So the next time you kneel before a statue, ask yourself, am I asking for something, or am I offering something? Am I seeking escape, or am I stepping into presence? Because the real temple is the moment, the real altar is your awareness, and the real Buddha is waiting to be remembered. Not in marble, not in gold, but in the silence behind your thoughts. There's no shame in bowing, but make sure you're not bowing out of fear. Bow out of love, out of humility, out of the recognition that what you seek has never truly left you. It was simply hiding behind the noise of your seeking. And maybe, just maybe, it's time to stop looking up at the statue and start looking into the mirror. Because when the illusion fades, what remains is not empty, it's awake. And that awakening, that quiet, radiant stillness, leads us somewhere even deeper. In that silence, something begins to reflect back at you. Not a god, not a guru, but the glimmer of something more honest, more intimate, something that has been with you from the very beginning. And now, it's time to meet it. What happens when the statue no longer answers you? When the chants fade into silence and the incense burns all the way down? When the robes and rituals no longer fill the void you've been carrying for years? Most people panic at that point. They think they've lost the path. They say, maybe I'm not meant for this. Maybe I've drifted too far. But what if that silence was the doorway? What if losing the Buddha you imagine was the first step toward discovering the one within? We don't often realize this, but the Buddha we seek has no name, no face, no history. He's not from India. He's not from 2,000 years ago. He's not made of marble or gold. He's the part of you that's watching all of this unfold, quietly, patiently, without judgment. He's the mirror, and you are the one standing in front of it. But here's the thing about mirrors. They don't show you what you want to see. They show you what is. The lines, the scars, the masks, the restless eyes always looking for something. Mirrors don't lie. And the Buddha within, the one beyond form, never speaks in flattery. He simply reflects. There's a story from a Zen monastery where a young monk was frustrated. He had memorized scriptures. He had fasted, meditated, chanted, yet still no enlightenment. He approached the master and asked, "When will I awaken?" The master said nothing. He simply handed the monk a mirror. The monk stared into it, at first confused, then angry, then still, because in that silence, he saw not just his face, but everything he'd been running from, the craving for progress, the fear of failure, the subtle pride in being spiritual. And just like that, a crack appeared in his ego, a crack wide enough for the light to start shining through. You see, we think of awakening as something grand, a thunderclap, a moment of cosmic revelation, but often it begins with something so simple we almost miss it. A moment of honesty, a moment when we stop performing, when we stop trying to become, and allow ourselves to simply be. That's when the mirror starts to work, not by changing who we are, but by showing us we were never broken, just clouded, just distracted, just believing stories about who we're supposed to be. The Buddha didn't come to make us into something else. He came to reveal what's already here. That's the power of the mirror. It doesn't add anything. It removes distortion. So when you look into it, you don't see a better version of yourself. You see what's been beneath the layers all along: spaciousness, stillness, compassion without effort, awareness without boundary, your true nature. But here's the challenge. Most people turn away when the mirror starts to reflect too clearly. They see the anger, the jealousy, the deep, aching loneliness. They've tried to cover with knowledge and good deeds, and they think, this can't be enlightenment. This can't be the Buddha within. But it is, because to see clearly is the beginning of freedom. There is no light without shadow, and the courage to look, honestly, nakedly, is what separates the seeker from the awakened. Imagine for a moment, you're sitting quietly, eyes closed, nothing to prove, nothing to gain. You feel a wave of sadness arise, or doubt, or irritation, instead of fighting it. You just watch it, you name nothing, you resist nothing. You just let it be, and slowly, something shifts. You realize, you are not the sadness, you are not the thought, you are not even the one trying to get rid of it. You are the space it moves through, the silent witness. That is Buddha nature. No thunder, no miracle, just a quiet return to what's been here all along. The mirror is working, not by showing you someone new, but by helping you remember what was never lost. The world will always try to convince you that you're not enough. It will sell you identities, roles, spiritual labels. Even Buddhist can become a costume if worn without understanding. But the mirror doesn't care about titles. It doesn't reflect how many chants you've memorized or how many hours you've meditated. It reflects your presence, your willingness to look without flinching. And in that looking, truth emerges, quietly, completely. The Buddha didn't escape the world. He transcended the illusion of separation. And he left us the ultimate gift, a mirror hidden in plain sight, not on an altar, but in every breath, every emotion, every moment you choose to stay present, instead of running. So the next time you feel lost, uncertain, disconnected from your path, don't go looking for another answer. Sit down, be still, and hold up the mirror. Ask nothing, expect nothing. Just look, and when you do, you may finally glimpse the one who's been watching this whole time. Not outside, not above, but here, in you. And as that image begins to take shape, you may find that the more clearly you see yourself, the more clearly you begin to see everything else. Not as separate, not as other, but as reflections of the same still, silent awareness that lives behind all things, a mirror, infinite and compassionate, waiting not to be worshipped, but remembered. There comes a moment in every seeker's life when the outer road runs out. You've walked the sacred trails, chanted in temples under starlit skies, met teachers with wise eyes and gentle words, carried malas, studied sutras, sat cross-legged in silence, hoping to find something just beyond the next breath. And then, one day, you stop, not because you failed, but because something deep inside whispers, it's time to turn around. Not away from the path, but inward. The real pilgrimage doesn't begin when your feet touch the soil of a distant monastery. It begins when your attention returns to the one place you've avoided the most, your own mind. It's strange, isn't it? We'll cross oceans for wisdom, climb mountains for a glimpse of truth, but to sit quietly and face the chaos inside, that takes more courage than we ever expected. Because the inner landscape is not neatly arranged. It's wild, unpredictable, full of echoes we thought we had silenced. But here's the secret: that's the temple, not the spotless altar, not the golden statues, but this raw, unfiltered mind, alive with craving, fear, memories, hopes. This is where the real practice begins. There's an old story of a devoted man who traveled hundreds of miles to visit a renowned teacher. When he arrived, exhausted, he said, "Master, I've come seeking truth." The master nodded. "Then go back home," he said, "and sit alone in your room for 7 days. Speak to no one. Read nothing, just watch your mind." The man was stunned. No mantra, no blessing. The master smiled gently. "You've carried your questions across the world. Now let them answer themselves." What he discovered in that week was not what he expected, not peace, not bliss, but noise, relentless looping thoughts, anxieties dressed as insight, dreams playing tug-of-war with fears, and somewhere beneath all of that, a stillness, not loud, not proud, just present, like a quiet flame that had never gone out, only buried under the ashes of distraction. Turning inward is not about escaping the world. It's about seeing it more clearly. Because when we begin to observe the mind, without judgment, without trying to fix or control, we realize something radical. We are not the thoughts, not the memories, not even the voice narrating our life story. We are the one watching, the awareness that sees, but is not stained by what it sees. Inward attention is a gentle discipline, not a battle, but a bowing, a sacred listening. You sit down, you breathe. You don't chase enlightenment like a prize. You let it emerge like the sun behind clouds, and you begin to notice. The mind jumps, you bow to it. The mind fears, you bow to it. The mind clings, you bow again, not out of weakness, but reverence. Because each movement of the mind is another teacher, showing you where you're still holding on. This is the heart of meditation, not the posture, not the technique, but the return, over and over. Back to presence, back to breath, back to the quiet watcher. Beneath it all, you're not trying to stop the mind. You're learning how to not get pulled in. You watch anger rise and fall. You watch craving appear, then dissolve. You realize emotions are just weather, temporary passing, never who you are. And slowly something shifts. You're no longer at war with yourself. The inner pilgrimage is not always pleasant, but it is always sacred. Because every time you sit in stillness, you step out of the prison of identification. You leave behind the noise of who you think you should be and come closer to the truth of what you already are. And that truth, unshaken, aware, and silent, is what all the outer journeys were pointing to. It's easy to forget this. The world offers so many escapes, more teachings, more teachers, more techniques, all promising peace. But the mind that is always seeking can never be still. At some point, you have to stop collecting spiritual souvenirs and come home, not to a house, not to a doctrine, but to presence, to the silent truth you've always carried, but rarely listened to. So if you're tired, if the path feels heavy, if the old inspirations don't stir you anymore, maybe it's not the end. Maybe it's the invitation you've been waiting for, to stop walking in circles around yourself and sit quietly in the center of your being, because that center, that still luminous core, doesn't need improvement. It only needs recognition. The inner pilgrimage is the most important journey you'll ever take, not because it leads to something new, but because it brings you back to what you've always been. Not a seeker, not a sinner, not a soul lost in time, but awareness itself. And once you see that clearly, the question changes. It's no longer, where do I go next? It becomes something much simpler, much deeper. What if I don't need to go anywhere at all? Every path begins with guidance. We need maps when the terrain is unfamiliar. We need teachers when we're just learning to walk. And in the beginning, the sutras feel like lifeboats, the chants like anchors, the teachers like lighthouses in a storm. They give us shape, structure, and somewhere to rest our uncertainty. And that's okay at first, but what happens when the boat becomes the destination? When we clutch the map so tightly, that we forget to look at the landscape around us. There's a silent danger in mistaking the finger for the moon. Even when that finger is sacred, we love to follow. It feels safe. It's easier to copy someone else's stillness than to discover our own. Easier to quote a master than to sit in the silence he pointed toward. But the Buddha didn't say, "Repeat after me." He said, "Come and see." That's an invitation, not to become a scholar, but a seer, not to become a believer, but an explorer of your own mind. There's a story of a monk who clung to the Buddha's words as if they were holy treasure. He knew every verse, could recite every sutra in flawless rhythm. One day, his teacher took a single page from the canon, held it up, and set it on fire. The monk was horrified. The teacher said quietly, "Did you think the truth was printed in ink? Texts are guides, traditions are scaffolding, teachers are lamps, but at some point, you must put down the book. You must walk without leaning. You must trust that the same light that awakened the Buddha also lives inside you." That doesn't mean we reject the teachings. It means we stop clinging to them. The raft is essential, but only to cross the river. Once you're on the other shore, you don't keep dragging it behind you. It's tempting to hide behind tradition, to collect more teachings, follow more methods, gather more spiritual credentials. But awakening doesn't come from how much you know. It comes from how deeply you're willing to see, without the filter of authority, because truth, real truth, doesn't need permission. It simply is. And yes, there will be fear. Letting go of the teacher feels like betrayal. Letting go of the lineage feels like arrogance. But the most honorable thing you can do for a true teacher is to stand on your own feet. They didn't guide you so you'd cling to their shadow. They guided you so you rediscover the light in your own being. Think of the Buddha himself. He studied under masters. He practiced every tradition available to him. And then he walked away, not out of disrespect, but because he realized no one could walk the final stretch for him. Not a scripture, not a ritual, not even the gods. Only his own direct insight could open the door. This is what it means to walk the inner path, to take the wisdom that was handed down and let it burn clean in the fire of your own experience, to bow to your teachers with gratitude, and then leave the temple, to sit under your own Bodhi tree. So if you find yourself leaning too heavily on the tradition, ask gently, is this still guiding me, or is it holding me? Is it pointing to the truth or blocking my view? Because even sacred tools can become cages when we forget their purpose. The true teacher lives in presence. The real scripture is written in the silence between thoughts, and the highest tradition is simply this: awareness, clear, unmoved, alive. Letting go doesn't mean walking away from the path. It means walking through it until there is no more path to walk, until there is only the open sky of direct knowing. No robes, no chance, no form, just this moment, just this breath, just the unfiltered truth of what you are. And when that moment comes, when the crutches fall away and you're left standing with nothing but stillness, don't panic. You haven't lost the way. You've simply stopped searching and started seeing, not through the eyes of tradition, but through the eye of wisdom itself. And what you see there will change everything. There's a silence you don't hear with your ears, a stillness you don't notice until the world around you stops spinning. It doesn't come with fireworks or revelations. It doesn't need a mantra or a ceremony. It waits patiently, like a lake undisturbed by wind. This is the still heart. We're so used to movement, chasing, striving, improving. Even our spiritual life becomes a to-do list. Meditate more, read more, seek more. But the Buddha you're searching for doesn't live at the end of effort. He resides in the space, between two thoughts, in the pause, between the inhale and exhale. In that soft, silent awareness, you overlook every day. You don't need to become something. You need to remember what's already here. That stillness inside you, the one you feel in fleeting moments, right before sleep, or when a sunset steals your breath. That is not a coincidence. That is not a passing feeling. That's the doorway. There's a Zen saying, when the mind is still, the Buddha speaks. But he doesn't speak in words. He speaks in presence, in being, not doing, not thinking, just being. And yet stillness feels unnatural at first, unproductive, empty. We sit down to meditate, and the mind screams to be useful. Shouldn't you be doing something? Yes, you should be doing nothing, because in that nothing, everything is revealed. A monk once asked his master, "What is the path to awakening?" The master poured tea into his cup until it overflowed. The monk shouted, "It's spilling." The master said, "Exactly. Your mind is too full to receive anything." Stillness is the art of emptying. Emptying the noise, the judgments, the identities you've worn like armor. Only when the cup is empty can it hold the truth. But here's the paradox: you can't force stillness. Try to achieve it, and you've already lost it. It's like trying to calm water with your hands. The more you stir, the more it ripples. True stillness arises when you stop trying, when you let the mud settle and allow the water to clear on its own. In the heart that no longer resists, no longer argues with reality, no longer grasps or avoids or defines. In that heart, the Buddha appears, not as a being, but as a boundless knowing space, vast and intimate, silent but alive. This is not philosophy. It's not something to memorize. It's something to feel. Right here, right now, you may ask, if the Buddha lives in this stillness, why is it so hard to find? Because we've built our lives on motion. Our identities are woven into the noise. To be still feels like disappearing, and in some ways, you do disappear. The false you dissolves. The self that needs to prove, to be seen, to be right, to be someone, that self slowly fades, and in its place, there is only awareness, not you being aware, just awareness. Imagine a candle in a windless room, no flickering, no movement, only quiet, steady light. That's the heart. Once desire has subsided, once fear has released its grip, that's where the Buddha lives, not in golden statues or distant heavens, but in the quiet flame of your own presence. Some people spend their lives chasing mystical experiences. They want visions, bliss, ecstasy, but the Buddha's deepest teaching was not about peak experiences. It was about freedom from craving, even craving for the spiritual, because true liberation isn't dramatic, it's deeply ordinary. It's being fully here, in this breath, with nothing left to grasp. That's the beauty of the still heart. It doesn't demand anything from you. It doesn't judge or compare. It simply is. It welcomes you as you are, not a student, not a seeker, not even a self, just presence, just life, witnessing itself. And once you rest there, truly rest, you realize you were never far from the Buddha. You just didn't recognize the silence as sacred. No need to chant, no need to strive, no need to search. The truth is already still. It's already whole, it's already home. And in that stillness, quiet and complete, you will remember what you've never truly forgotten. The Buddha lives here. He always has. We imagine awakening as a grand event, a lightning strike, a moment of blinding clarity that splits the sky of our lives in two. But the truth is far more quiet, far more subtle, and infinitely closer. It's not in the mountain cave. It's not at the feet of a master. It's not even in the final hour of meditation. It's in this breath, this spoonful of soup, this dusty sidewalk under your feet. You see, we've been taught to separate the sacred from the ordinary. We light incense in temples, but curse in traffic. We bow to statues, but look past the homeless man on the corner. We meditate for an hour, then forget our presence the rest of the day. But awakening isn't something you do in silence alone. It's something you live, moment by moment by moment. The Buddha is not just found in statues. He's hidden in the smallest acts of awareness. When you pause before you speak, when you listen without needing to respond, when you wash the dishes and feel the warm water on your hands. Really feel it. You're there, you've stepped out of the dream and into the now, and that's where awakening lives. There's a Zen saying, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. Nothing changes, and yet everything does, because it's not what you do. It's how you show up for it, with presence, with gentleness, with open eyes. Think of a single drop of water on a leaf. In that drop, you can see the entire sky, not because the drop changed, but because you looked closely. That's awakening. It's seeing what's already here, without the filters of judgment, habit, or distraction. It's brushing your teeth as if you were brushing the Buddha's teeth. It's tying your shoes like you were dressing the divine. It's drinking tea with full presence, not for the caffeine, not out of routine, but because in that cup, the whole universe is cradled. One of the most overlooked spiritual teachings is that enlightenment is deeply ordinary. It's not a new personality. It's not a spiritual glow. It's not perfect peace all the time. It's presence, compassion, clarity. And these are found, not in some far-off land of perfection, but in your daily chaos. Yes, even in your stress, your irritation, your dishes, your inbox, all of it is the path. A layperson once asked the Buddha, is it possible to live a spiritual life while raising a family? And the Buddha smiled. He said, not only is it possible, it is necessary. The path is not somewhere else. It is here. What we call mundane is sacred in disguise, but most people don't see it because they're always waiting for more. A better moment, a more spiritual state, a more peaceful mind. But this moment, yes, this one, is the only gateway you'll ever have. Not the one you wish for, not the one you plan for, the one that's happening. Right now, when you're walking, just walk. Feel the earth beneath your feet. Listen to the rhythm of your steps. Let the breeze brush your skin, like the whisper of 1,000 lifetimes. When you speak, speak from stillness. Let your words rise from presence, not reaction. Let them be few, but real. When you love someone, love with your whole attention. Put down the phone. Look into their eyes. That gaze is a temple. This is not hard to do, but it is hard to remember. Why? Because the modern world trains you to move fast. Scroll, click, consume. Rush from task to task. Presence feels unfamiliar, even awkward, but you can relearn it. You can return not through effort, but through awareness, through noticing that you've wandered, and gently coming back. You're not meant to live this life asleep. You're not meant to miss the beauty in the small things, the sunlight through a window, the laugh of a stranger, the silence between two friends who understand each other. This is all part of the great unfolding. This is the Dharma in motion. And when you start to see this, truly see it, everything becomes the teacher. The angry customer, the spilled coffee, the long red light. The moment your child hugs you without warning, each one says, wake up, I am here, so are you. Awakening doesn't happen once, it happens again, and again, and again. Each time you return, each time you remember, each time you breathe in. And say silently, this is it. Because it is, it always has been. So don't wait for the perfect retreat. Don't wait for the right moment. The Buddha is in your kitchen, in your office, in the subway. He's not hiding, you are. And when you stop searching, even for him, you'll realize he never left. We begin the journey with sincere longing. a desire to wake up, to break free from suffering, to find peace, truth, enlightenment, whatever word we choose. We read, we meditate, we listen to talks. We climb inner mountains, journal our insights, count our breaths like treasures, and then something strange happens. We become obsessed. With arriving, we think, if I just meditate longer, if I read more sutras, if I attend that next retreat, then I'll finally get there. And without noticing, the search becomes an addiction. The path becomes a performance. Suddenly, we're not walking the Dharma. We're chasing an idea of it. And that, ironically, takes us further from the truth. It's a subtle trap, maybe the most dangerous one, because it wears the mask of sincerity. It speaks in the voice of progress. It hides behind incense and mantras and a perfectly upright posture. But underneath it all is the same restlessness, the same hunger that drives material ambition. Now dressed in spiritual clothing, you may no longer crave money or fame, but now you crave awakening. You crave stillness. You crave to not crave, and so the ego survives. But now it wears robes. There's a Zen story of a student who practiced for years and asked his master, "Am I getting close to enlightenment?" The master said, "You are farther now than when you first arrived." The student was confused. "I've practiced so hard, how can that be?" The master looked him in the eye and said, "Before you were empty, now you're full of yourself." Spiritual ambition is different from devotion. Devotion is soft, it opens you, it listens. Ambition is hard, it narrows you, it wants to win, but there's nothing to win. There's no enlightenment to collect, no badge to pin on your chest, no final moment when the universe claps and says, "Congratulations, you did it." Because the truth is, you are not on a ladder, you are in a circle, and every time you try to climb higher, you miss the sacredness of where you stand. We have to ask ourselves, who is seeking, who wants to be enlightened? What is this version of me that imagines it will one day become perfect? And if we look closely, we'll see that self is a shadow, a ghost we're chasing in the fog. The Buddha never said, "Strive to become a better version of yourself." He said, "Let go of self. See through the illusion." He didn't teach us how to polish the ego. He taught us how to dissolve it. So if your spiritual journey is making you more tense, more proud, more judgmental of others who are as far along as you, pause, breathe. That's not the Dharma, that's the ego in disguise. Real practice is humble. It doesn't need to prove anything. It doesn't show off wisdom or quote ancient texts to sound profound. It just lives, simply, quietly, compassionately, like a candle that doesn't announce its flame. It just gives light. When you stop striving for enlightenment, you create space for it to find you, not as a dramatic event, not as cosmic fireworks, but in the stillness between thoughts, in the breath you didn't force. In the moment, you forget yourself completely and simply become awareness itself. That is grace, that is freedom. Letting go of spiritual ambition doesn't mean you stop practicing. It means you stop grasping. You stop turning practice into a project. You stop measuring yourself like a stock chart. You meditate, not to become better, but because silence is beautiful. You bow, not to gain merit, but because reverence humbles the heart. You breathe, because life itself is sacred. There's an old metaphor: when the finger points to the moon, don't worship the finger. Spiritual ambition clings to the finger. It idolizes the tools, the teachings, the techniques, but forgets to look up and see the moon. And the moon has always been there, shining, even when we're too busy chasing our own reflection in a pond. Let this be the soft revolution, where we drop the race, where we give up the chase, where instead of trying to become awakened, we learn to just be fully here, now, not perfect, not transcendent, but present. That's enough. That's always been enough. And as this seeking fades, something gentle awakens. You walk slower. You judge less. You smile more. You stop trying to arrive and realize you never left. No more ladders, no more goals, just this, just now, just the Buddha, smiling quietly. Inside you, there comes a moment on the path when everything quiets, not because you forced it to, but because there's nothing left to chase. You no longer ask, when will I awaken? Because something inside already knows. You were never asleep. From the very beginning, you were whole, not broken, not lacking, just unaware of what was already here. The Buddha you sought in temples, in texts, and teachers was never elsewhere. He was never outside. He was sitting silently at the center of your being, patiently waiting for you to turn around. We search for truth like one who has lost their glasses. While they're resting on their head, we seek peace while clenching our hearts. We want to become enlightened, as if it were something distant, but in truth, there is no becoming. There is only remembering. You are not a separate self trying to find the Buddha. You are the Buddha, momentarily playing the game of forgetting. You are not a drop returning to the ocean. You are the ocean, believing it is a drop. The veil that kept you from seeing this truth was never made of stone. Only thought, only identity, only habit, and now it begins to dissolve. There is no longer a you watching the breath. There is only breathing. No you being mindful, just awareness. Aware of itself. No more inner commentator, grading your practice, judging your progress, just stillness, just space, just presence. Realizing the Buddha within is not an explosion. It is not a vision of light or the sound of celestial bells. It is subtle, it's quiet, it's as ordinary as noticing. You're no longer trying so hard. As simple as walking barefoot on the earth and realizing you feel everything and need nothing. When there's no more separation, you stop worshiping and you start bowing from the heart, not to a statue, not to a doctrine, but to life itself. You see the Buddha in the one sweeping the temple and in the one who never set foot in it. You hear the Dharma in the silence between words and in the cries of a newborn. You see the sacred, not in escaping the world, but in embracing it fully. To realize the Buddha with it is to see through the great illusion that there is a self who needs to be fixed. It's the end of the seeker, not because the search was wrong, but because its purpose is complete. The journey collapses into this moment, not ahead, not behind. Just here, this is not about being passive. This is not detachment from life. In fact, it's the opposite. When there is no more separation, you love more fiercely, you listen more deeply, you serve more humbly, you no longer help others to be good or to gain merit, but because you are them. There is no boundary between giver and receiver, no wall between your joy and another's suffering, just one life, beating in countless forms. You don't become the Buddha by escaping the world. You realize the Buddha by entering it so fully that there's nothing left outside you. Your joy is the Buddha. Your grief is the Buddha. Even your doubt is just the Buddha asking a question in your voice. The final illusion is that awakening is a thing you reach, but it's not a peak to conquer. It's the dissolving of the climber. The moment you stop trying to touch the moon, you realize your hands have always been light. You don't need to find the Buddha. You just need to stop believing you are separate from him. So here you are, not someone on the path, but the path itself, not someone seeking light, but the light, noticing itself through human eyes. There is no more need to ask, where is the Buddha? Because now you know, he is the silence between your thoughts, the still point beneath your emotions, the witness who never left. He is you, without the mask, and he's been smiling all along. You have walked far through questions and doubts, rituals and silence, seeking and surrender, you've climbed the mountain of knowledge, only to discover the summit is a mirror. You didn't find a new self waiting for you. You found what had always been there. Quiet, patient, beneath the noise, you. The journey ends where it began, but you're not the same traveler anymore. You began this path, looking for answers. Now you bow to the mystery. You sought something holy outside you. Now everything you touch feels sacred. You search for the Buddha as if he were lost. Now you smile, because you were never apart. Coming home is not about returning to a place. It's about recognizing that there was never any place else to be. This body, this moment, this breath, they are not obstacles to awakening. They are the very doorways to it. You don't need incense, or robes, or chants, unless they help you listen more deeply. You don't need to renounce the world. You only need to renounce your illusion of separation. You don't need to believe in anything, not even in Buddhism, because when you've seen clearly, belief dissolves into knowing. The Buddha did not want followers. He wanted those who see, to see not with the eyes, but with the heart unclenched, the mind untangled, and the soul unafraid. To live without running, without comparing, without pretending, to wake up each day, not chasing meaning, but being it. You are not a seeker anymore. You are not even a spiritual person. You are simply alive, present, open, whole. You can laugh without needing a reason, cry without hiding, sit in stillness without fear, and love. Oh, you can love without needing anything in return, because now you're no longer loving as someone reaching out. You are loving as the light itself. The Buddha is not behind you as a teacher, not above you as a god, not ahead of you as a goal. He is within you, as you, in every step you take. When you help someone, the Buddha is your hands. When you listen fully, the Buddha is your ears. When you simply breathe in peace, not trying, not forcing, the Buddha is your breath. What began as a search has ended in stillness. What began as effort has softened into ease. What began as ambition has melted into presence. This is the return, not to who you used to be, but to who you've always been. Beneath the forgetting, you've come home to yourself, and this self is not a thing, not a name, not a story. It is awareness, it is space, it is love. With no border, there will still be mornings. When the mind gets noisy, there will still be moments when doubt returns. But now, you know where silence lives. You know the path back to center. You know how to bow inward without kneeling to fear. And that knowing, that quiet trust, is the greatest freedom. So let the world swirl, let time pass, let the seasons change, but you stay rooted in the still heart of things, not indifferent, not distant, but awake and fully here. When pain comes, you hold it gently. When joy comes, you hold it lightly. And when others lose their way, you offer your presence, not to fix them, but to remind them of their own light, just as you were once reminded. This is the end of the path and the beginning of life, not as a quest, but as a quiet, luminous unfolding. You don't need to carry anything now, not teachings, not titles, not even Buddhism. Only presence, only compassion, only truth. So simple, so silent, that the whole universe rests inside it. You came seeking the Buddha, and now you walk as one. Not by changing your name, or shaving your head, or sitting in a monastery, but by living this moment, so fully, so freely, that nothing is left outside of you, not even him. Welcome home.